Hi,
Hi, Hi, Kelly.
good to see you.
You too. Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Donna Conwell.
My name is Kelly Sicat, and we are your hosts of Scratch Space.
And we're delighted to welcome you back to the first of our Scratch Space programs for 2021. Scratch Space is a virtual forum hosted by the Lucas Artist Residency Program at Montalvo Arts Center, which is located in Saratoga, California, on the ancestral lands of the Ohlone people. With Scratch Space, we are bringing together visual artists, scholars, composers, activists, writers, and others to collectively explore what kinds of radical imaginaries can unfold in this moment of pandemic, of racial reckoning, of economic uncertainty, civil unrest, and environmental crisis.
We're interested in how we think about what is possible and how we can use our imaginations to build a better present and future, and how we can retool and create better and more equitable models for living and working together. So, Donna, tell us about our speakers today.
Well, I'm really delighted to introduce our guests for this week, Stephanie Dinkins and Jason Edward Lewis, who are two incredible artists, scholars, and thought leaders. Stephanie Dinkins is a transmedia artist and professor at Stony Brook University, where she holds the Kusama Endowed Chair in Art. And she creates platforms for dialogue about artificial intelligence as it intersects with race, gender, aging, and our future histories. And she's particularly driven to work with communities of color to create a more equitable, values-grounded artificial intelligence ecosystem. And Stephanie is joined by Jason Edward Lewis, who is a digital media theorist, a poet, and a software designer. And he is the University Research Chair in Computational Media and the Indigenous Future Imaginary, as well as Professor of Computational Arts at Concordia University in Montreal. And Jason directs the Initiative for Indigenous Futures and co-directs the Indigenous Futures Research Center and the Indigenous Protocols and AI workshops. So I'm really excited to speak to them today about their work and this fascinating field of artificial intelligence.
I've been looking forward to this conversation for months, so I'm thrilled for us to get started. I want to let our audiences know that you can find links to the artists' bios in the chat. And I also want to thank Nathan Zanon for being our behind the scenes producer for the event, along with AI Media, who's providing live closed captioning for this event. I believe you need to go to the closed captioning button to be able to see the captions. I'll disappear now, leave Donna, Stephanie, and Jason to talk for about 45 minutes, at which point I'll return to gather and ask questions from our audience. Enjoy yourselves. See you soon.
Thank you, Kelly. Well, thank you, Jason. Thank you, Stephanie, for joining us here today. I'm so excited to speak with you about your work and the subject of artificial intelligence. I come to this discussion with a very limited understanding of AI, although I've tried hard to educate myself in preparing for this conversation. And I do recognize that AI is something that's going to be, is going to be shaping our lives in truly profound ways. I think more relevantly, for me, I work at an artist residency program that is in the heart of Silicon Valley, which, as we know, is a global hub for the AI sector. And a lot of our visitors and supporters work in that field. So this feels an important conversation for us to be hosting. I also want to acknowledge that in our virtual audience today, we have some members from our partner organization, the SETI Institute, that is very active in the field of AI and organizes an artificial intelligence research accelerator for space science. And also through its artist residency program is launching a SETI AI artist residency fellowship in collaboration with Ars Electronica. So I just want to give a little bit of context of, where we're coming from in terms of this conversation. I know there's some topics of discussion that you would both like to kind of delve into. But I'm hoping that before that, we can just start by asking each of you to give us a kind of brief introduction to your work and how you came to the field of artificial intelligence, and help us understand what was it about that field that first interested you. So I'm wondering if we could start with you, Stephanie. You know, you come out of this training in photography, and your first brush with AI, as I understand it, was your work with the robot Bina 48 in 2014.
Yes, and I hope you can all hear me. I'm getting messages that my internet is not stable today. But for sure, you know, I have no background in technology beyond the arts, and ran into this crazy robot on YouTube in 2014, and it set off a myriad of questions in my brain in terms of what the future was bringing towards us. And really, I was smitten by the robot because it was a Black woman, and I thought that was highly unusual. And then I started to think about what the implications of that and why it was a Black woman, how it was funded, how it started coming into being, and what were the aims. And, you know, my first entree into this world was simply deciding that I wanted to become friends with this robot. So I could start to try to contextualize artificial intelligence in reference to, you know, where I sit, which is Blackness, womanhood, right? Like, what does that mean for us? And so through talking to Bina 48, I started to really get a slight understanding of the technology, but really what came to mind were questions about what the future holds for those of us who are not helping to form these new technologies that are starting to become more and more ubiquitous. And, you know, so Bina 48 is a kind of robot that maybe we're not all going to have soon, but we are all touched by algorithms. So it started me really questioning like the algorithmic future and what is possible and how could we create a good outcome for communities of color, especially when at the time there was a lot of reporting on, you know, bias in AI, bias in cameras, how judicial systems were using algorithms to start thinking about recidivism and who gets, you know, charged with what and for how long they were jailed. Like it seemed like the implications were so large that it's just hyper important to start thinking about it. And since then I've been thinking forward, and every project I've done from that point on has become about more questions, right? So here, can I befriend a robot? Next, what does it mean for that robot to be a Black woman? And then if that robot, which is really great, but still I saw things that I was questioning in the way it was answering questions, because most of the answers I would ask it about race and love were really PC answers that it would give me back, which felt flat. So then I was like, well, how do I start to make a rounder version of what a Black community or Blackness might look like in this space? So I started to make my own kind of chatbot that is based on my family, right? And from there, it just becomes questions upon questions till now I'm thinking about digital civic systems and how AI might inform them, and really how our stories inform them.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk more with you about your own creation of your own AI entity, and I hope we can move into that later on in the conversation. In your work with Bina 48, did you actually get to input some information into the robot as part of that?
Yeah, in a way I did. I was lucky enough. So every time you talk to the robot, you're basically informing it. And I would visit once or twice a year through maybe a year and a half ago. And then I actually got to sit down with Bina Rothblatt, who is one of the people that Bina 48 is based on. And we talked about her experiences as a Black woman in depth. And that interview was directly put into Bina 48 as a source of data. Right. So this kind of give and take. And actually, it's been great because, you know, Bruce Duncan is being a 48 curator, the person who takes care of her the most. We've had these conversations that I think inform both of us and how we're thinking about these systems and what they might mean or how they enter a world.
Yeah, and so interesting to think about how does AI know what it knows, and the sort of embedded problem around that. Thank you. So Jason, I'd love to turn to you now to give us a little introduction to your path and how you came to this work. And you worked in Silicon Valley research labs. Your early art practice involved poetry and dynamic texts. So can you tell us about your path to this work?
Yeah, it's funny because as I've been spending more time with it over the last couple of years, sort of kind of seeing further and further back where the things started. I was just in a talk today with a group of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research AI chairs, giving a keynote to them and talking about how, as an undergraduate at Stanford in the 80s, I was a student of Terry Winograd. It's one of the sort of early AI pioneers, and also David Rumelhart, who is one of the pioneers in neural nets, taking courses with them. But it didn't grab me back then. I mean, my basic interest for years has been how is it even possible that we can make ourselves intelligible to each other as humans, and then the effect of technology on our ability to communicate. So how technology was intervening in different ways in our speaking with each other. So, but kind of the immediate thing was in 5 years ago now, 6 years ago, I guess, I started going to Hawaii more often and fell into conversation with a historian there, Noe Arista. We spent a lot of time in the archives, and we started talking in general about how digital technology can be used, for instance, to support the dissemination of Hawaiian cultural knowledge, and how it could be used to help preserve the archives that she was working in. Sort of just those questions of like, how do we take this technology and apply it in a specifically Indigenous context? And then that led to her and I and a media artist and theorist named Archer Pachowis, who is Cree, based in Toronto, who I've known for 20 some odd years, and a PhD student who works for me, Suzanne Kite, deciding that we wanted to respond to this essay by Joy Ito, the now disgraced head of the MIT Media Lab, who had written an essay called Resisting Reduction, which was, kind of in a technological context side of, this big critique of the sort of the narrowness and the brittleness of the ways in which intelligence was being construed in the industry. But from from a social sciences perspective was not news at all, right? It's sort of critique that's been around, at least since the 60s or 70s, about all kinds of different kinds of computational systems. Anyways, we decided this was a moment for us to respond, because we'd been talking about what does intelligence mean from an Indigenous perspective? What do these tools mean? And so we wrote this essay called Making Kin with the Machines, where kind of laid down sort of a basic critique based on the differences between sort of Western utilitarian knowledge frameworks, heavily infected by monotheism and capitalism, and that sort of led to this kind of mythology of the human as this, primarily a rational being, right? Acts, along rational lines, and also is self-interested, right? That the main thing that humans do is they optimize their self-interests. And we're like, well, that's not what's in our cultures. What we see is a real emphasis on relationality and on understanding that there are many types of agents in the world. Some of them are human, some of them are non-human, and that differs depending on which culture you're talking about, and how that is understood, differs too. And so, yeah, so we wrote that essay, Making Kin with Machines. And that really kind of, realized it kind of brought together a bunch of different things I was interested in. So part of it is my art practice, which is very much like trying to think through what is the expressivity of computation? What's the expressivity of interaction, of network connectivity, sort of all these kind of capabilities that come along with the digital. How can they be used for expressive purposes? And that's a big part of what my art practice is about, is thinking through what can you do with text in a digital environment that enhances the text in the same way that rhythm and rhyme and location on the page, does for more traditional poetry.
That's an example we're seeing on the screen here. One of those.
Yeah, so that's a piece called No Choice About the Terminology. And that's a piece, it's an interactive piece, touch piece, where there's I think it's about 20 lines of a poem that are on the screen, sort of moving back and forth, and you can like stop them and read them, and you can flick them off and send them flying, or have them all move slowly. And then if you really sort of like spend some time, then the screen kind of gets taken over by these purple shapes and sort of disrupts your reading. But the poem itself is about how the terms that we use are important, So I was thinking about, that was right at the time when we were moving from, Aboriginal to Indigenous, that we were having like arguments about whether that really mattered and how does it matter. And it's where, land acknowledgements were just kind of starting to kind of come into being in North America. They'd already been in place in like Australia and New Zealand. And so it was a meditation on how important it is, how important language is, because language, it's how you define yourself, and it's how others define you too. And sometimes you get defined in ways that you don't want to be defined. So it was thinking about that. So, and then, the Making Kin with Machines essay led into a series of workshops called the Indigenous Protocol and Artificial Intelligence workshops, which were in parts based in the Initiative for Indigenous Futures, which is a research partnership that I lead. And those workshops were about getting a bunch of Indigenous people together. So 4 of us wrote the essay, and we're like, well, we got to go talk to some other folks. And so we brought 30 Indigenous folks, 35 people in total, to Honolulu for a 2-day workshop, which was just amazing, where we all, we just talked about what it might mean from our different communities' perspectives, both sort of the dangers, but then also some of the opportunities. And then we wrote a position paper that got published just this last summer, which I encourage everybody to go check out. It's free to download. I think Donna just posted the indigenous-a.net link. And there's analytical essays, there's journal articles, but there's poetry, there's artwork, because one of the kind of things that we all agreed on is, part of the damage that Western epistemologies do to the world is they divide it up into disciplines and pretend that they're not interconnected, right? Actually, they don't so much pretend that they're not interconnected. They pretend that you can understand everything about a discipline from within a discipline, right? And the Indigenous knowledge frameworks that we work in is everything's connected, and art making in particular is a very important way of generating knowledge as well as disseminating knowledge. So and so now there's the afterwards, as we sort of figure out what to do next step.
Well, I hope we can talk more in the conversation later on about the workshops and the Indigenous Protocol position paper, which, and we have posted links to all of that in the chat. It's an incredible document, lots to think about. And I was thinking about the essay about making kin with machines, and we've also posted a link to that, thinking about our relationship with AI, and also, returning to you, Stephanie, because, you've talked about your own, just skip over a couple of those slides, work with creating your own AI machine. You're kind of describing it as something kind of you're nurturing into being as a kind of family member. So I would be really interested to hear your thoughts about that, the kind of relationship we should be thinking about having with AI. But before then, Just to help give us some more further context to your work and thinking, it would be great to hear about these various sort of platforms that you've created to bring together communities of color to discuss the impact of artificial intelligence and algorithms on their lives, and kind of how to engage in a process of inserting themselves more fully into the creation of those technologies.
Sure. I find myself thinking about everything Jason just said and being so in line, and in a way, I've been thinking about community, right? As one who has to make community or doesn't have a naturally organic community here. And so I attach myself to communities, and in this case, communities of color. I'm in Brooklyn. I just start thinking from the highly personal in certain ways, and then spreading outwards towards communities that I know and touch. And in this instance, the picture that you're showing now is Project Al-Khwarizmi that was done downtown Brooklyn, inviting communities of color in. And really, when I started that, I was thinking about my neighbors, like, the 15 folks within doorstep of me, and starting to talk to them about, well, listen, are we aware of these things that are happening? There are ways in which we could protest them and ask that they don't happen, but it seems that these things are coming at us. And it seems that we stand to be left behind. Like, I'm always thinking about, not only thinking about what the technology can do and what harm it can do, but how it can be employed and deployed to do something else. And so how do we start to work with it? And what would we like to see from that technology? But the question first becomes, are we even aware to the extent to which our lives are touched by these technologies? And so I do workshops for Project Al-Khwarizmi where we discuss, like, where is your life being touched by an algorithm? Let's just start with that. And once you start to recognize that, is there any way that you can intercede or run around or even make something different? And I'm usually saying, when I'm saying make, I'm saying model in lots of ways, right? So model a different way that the technology might be engaged and used, or maybe using it yourself for different ends. And then finally asking, well, what's the in for you to actually get involved in thinking about really creating the space that would support your community, right? And for me, that becomes about thinking around education and how we educate ourselves and how we educate communities and people's out of thinking. They have the capability to even think about these questions, because the truth is, if it's presented in a way that is open, there are ways in. But if you start with the hard math, maybe you shut the door on a lot of people, right? So for instance, with these kids, they're Parson scholars, and we made chatbots, and I was asking them about the way they use language and what they would be interested enough to start really working. So they were making chatbots that did knock jokes, that spoke patois, entered phonetically, right? Just to hear it come out. And the idea is just to get you interested enough to start playing with it. And we're using Dialogflow here, which is a platform online that anyone can go and create a decent chatbot if they want. Now, the thing that's wrong about it is that it's very, question, answer, intent, answer. But it does let you see and pull back the veil a bit of how these things are informed and how the things around you are informed. So if you're thinking about, well, if I have to phonetically put in words in patois to get it to speak patois, what are the people who are making the systems who inform judges putting in, and how are we getting answers that are so skewed? And that's about the histories that we're using and just falling back on without questioning almost, right? It's about the way we're using algorithms and algorithms that we don't even have an idea of what they do or how they're functioning a lot of the times, right? So how do we start to question this? And in my case, it's like, well, how do we build something that does a thing that people say you can't do? Because a lot of the things that I've been engaged in have been things that people are telling me, oh no, you can't do that. Use small community data and do something viable? No, it's not going to work. And that's changed over the years. Like I'm hearing a slightly different message now. Now it's like, it's hard, but yeah, it's kind of doable.
So the orthodoxy has been the sort of use of huge amounts of data, right?
Right.
Another way to build these systems.
Exactly. And the question becomes, what happens if a community doesn't have a huge amount of data, right? And we still want to include what's important to that community in a specific way.
Mm-hmm.
And so then it's like, well, how do we make it? And if you make it, it's hard. Like if I'm making it, this is what the way that I was looking at it. If I make it, someone who is not technologically inclined, who's working with others to help, and through that making, I find myself consistently on the edge of the technology. So when I talk to folks about it, they're like, oh, you're approaching the same questions we are. We can't help you that easily because often I have residencies or something that will allow for people to help. And then they realize that I'm working on the same questions they are. But to me, that says that there's a broad, amazing spectrum of possibility and places to massage the technology. And how do we start to do that? So I really believe in bringing folks together. And I've done Project Al-Khwarizmi. This is AI Assembly, a very early iteration where we're bringing together mostly folks of color, but almost anyone who's interested in AI, who is a little higher level, right? So technologists, artists, theorists. In this picture, I love it because we have some people who are coming at it from a spiritual realm. We have some biologists, like a wide swath of people who are thinking about, well, what is it that we want to make out of this technology, and then have the power to immediately enact that. So I feel like there are these levels of speaking, but my practice has become such that I feel that I can't let one or the other go. I want to talk in a way to lots of different folks to get thought churning. I've even had really good discussions with 5-year-olds in certain ways, in terms of, they're pretty well predisposed by movies often to think about a technology in a certain way. So they'll talk to you, and then if you can kind of carry that conversation to a different place about, well, what is it? How is it? Why is it like that? And what would you like it to be? And so that's almost the conversation in every room. And now I run AI assemblies, right now, probably yearly for the past 2 years. And it's about getting folks together in community to think about the ways that we think about the world, and how we engage the technology to help support the world that we want to see, right? And help bring others to that space, actually. And I'll say one last thing that I'll add to that, and it's often about figuring out, well, if we're often dealing with the unseen or the things that people don't want to see, ways of thinking that are outside of the academy, or maybe we're code shifting and going back and forth. How do we start to push that into the system, right? The ecosystem that supports these kinds of technologies. Yeah.
It's fascinating. I'm wondering, Jason, if you would like to sort of respond to some of those ideas and like specifically around this idea of like generating AI through these kind of smaller community processes, and what
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the work that Stephanie's been doing is amazing. I think that, it's the kind of work that needs to be done across technology, not just AI. And it's interesting, and I think that's probably a side discussion. I'd love to talk with you about it, Stephanie. But like, why is it that AI is managing to mobilize the kind of the public imagination in a way about these issues that other technologies that also hook into these technologies haven't managed to do, right? Mm-hmm. But so part of where I'm coming from is that since 2008, I guess, we've been running skins workshops on Aboriginal storytelling and digital media. And so we've been working in Indigenous communities, teaching mainly Indigenous youth, but some of our youth are as old as 50, how to use digital media production tools to make video games, the machinima, to how to do programming and things like that, but sort of on a foundation of cultural knowledge. So we combine storytelling from the community, both from the participants themselves, but we bring in storytellers and elders, and we talk about why those stories are important. And also we talk about how those stories operate, right? So how they operate as epistemology, like how they operate as knowledge, how they operate to preserve the history and all those sorts of things. Because one of the big things that we want to communicate is that, that Indigenous people are, have been technologists for a very long time, right? And our communities and our cultures have been developing technology and innovative technology for a very long time. And that's the counter of the message that we get, that as Indigenous people, that's, we're not innovators, we're not technologists, we're not scientists, all this sort of discourse that has come out of the wonderful sort of like colonial white supremacist system that we live in North America and other places. So I really believe in, as much as possible doing that technology work in community and in and with community. And I totally agree. Like for me, the next step for the Indigenous protocol and AI work is this series of workshops that I'm calling Dereferencing AI, which are very much about, it's very similar. I think, I gotta go look more closely, Stephanie, at your stuff, make sure I'm not just copying what you've already done.
I think we've got echoes going on.
Where we've already did one of these as a prototype at MIT with the automated speech recognition research group there, where the idea is we brought together an Anishinaabe artist who is one of the protocol, the position paper authors. He brought in his sort of language, the language keeper that he works with for the Anishinaabe language. And we brought in another person from the workshop, Michael Running Wolf, and then a couple other Indigenous artists / developers, and met with these, computer scientists developing AI systems. Basically just had kind of this free-ranging discussion about how they go about the work of doing translation, right? Automated translation. But then the concerns from our side about what happens to our languages when it's fed through those systems, right? Because these systems are developed out of a worldview which looks at language as an not inert, well, in some ways an inert tool, right? Language is just this thing we use to kind of like get data from my head to your head. Whereas in most Indigenous communities that I know, and certainly the ones in that room, language is a carrier of knowledge, right? It's how the history and understanding of territory are carried. And when you do these kind of very simplistic translations that that machine translations do, even the sophisticated ones, there's all this information that gets lost, right? So for me, it's like I'm super interested in how do you work through, but at the same time, we're really interested in the potential that these tools have for helping to preserve our languages, right? And helping new people in the community learn the languages. So it's not like, okay, let's just write this off, right? It's like, okay, no, let's figure out how we can engage in this in a way that makes sense to us. And language is a particularly, big issue in terms of, we're low resource communities, Stephanie, right? So that's the term of art that's used in the the machine translation world is for Indigenous languages. There's not enough Indigenous language on the web that they can steal, right? That's what it comes down to, right? And so they can't build the systems. And part of what I was just saying in my previous conversation is I was like, you guys might have to think about the fact that, or the possibility that your basic methodology is unethical, right? That the thing that you've developed that allows you to take in and work with big data in this way and produce some amazing results at its very core is unethical. So everything you do about AI for good and the manifesto for AI ethics this and the declarations of AI responsibility that, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. You're just trying to put Band-Aids on like an infection, right? And, that's because they were like, hey, great, we're just going to go and like hoover up all this data. We're not going to ask anybody if it's okay.
Mm.
We're not going to get permission. We're not going to compensate them, etc. And I was trying to use that to illustrate the difference between sort of a Western sort of way of looking at things and Indigenous way of looking at things, which is like, you got to ask permission, make sure people get something out of it, make sure they understand what you're going to do with it, all those sorts of things, where I would hope, if we'd been in that position, we would have been like, okay, wait a second, maybe this is not the way we should develop this technology. We could, but maybe it's not the right way to go, or maybe it's the right way to go for very specific things. Yeah. So answering those questions, I think, require hyper local engagement, right? Mm-hmm. Like Stephanie's talking about. Like, it's like going to a community, dealing with the people who hold knowledge in that community and have a stake in it, and working with them to articulate what it is they want the technology to do for them, and doing the work of formalizing that, which is very challenging and is kind of the crux of the technical problem. Mm-hmm. And some of it may not be formalizable, right? You may not be able to turn some of it into math, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah. Yeah. Thinking about this question of data sovereignty, I'm wondering if Stephanie, you can talk to us about your work on Not the Only One, as a kind of creation of an AI that's really a memoir of several generations of your own family. One thing that I noticed kind of listening to you talking about this work, and this may have changed, but you talked about not wanting to put this on the cloud and having it on its own individual computers, and sort of preserving the integrity of that information belonging to you. And I also am reminded of a conversation we had with Jason earlier about, that not in some Indigenous worldviews, not all information is necessarily supposed to sustain perpetually, and that it could have its own life cycle. And of course, Jason can speak to this in a way that obviously I can't. But so I just want to get your thoughts about that, Stephanie, and also see if you could talk us through a little bit about your work on Not the Only One.
Yeah, I can definitely try to address some of that. Not the Only One as a practice has brought up many questions in itself, because I'm dealing with 3 generations, still living generations of my family. And it is family history. It was supposed to be a memoir. It's very interesting because it's evolved, because it doesn't seem to want to give that much information in very coherent ways in that sense. So it's more like talking to the 4th generation in a lineage, right? Because it does try to kind of take our information and then make its own sense of what we're giving, of what is asked of it, right? So it's deep learning. So it's trying to come up with its own kind of logics. And, I've been confronted with lots of questions through this project, because this is my family's history. And what I'm actually saying, and the pieces shown in galleries, big and small, so I'm putting it into public. It's not on the web as a thing that people can talk to right now. And yes, we're still trying to keep everything local on small computers so that we have control of the data, know exactly what's happened to it, know it hasn't leaked into multiple places, or think it hasn't leaked into multiple places, but that it's being cared for in a very particular manner. But that also means the project is uber slow. Like it's super slow. It gets stuck at each new decision is a point of is a sticking point. So for example, if you need to expand the data that the interview, so it's based on interviews. So 3 people sat down and we talked to each other. And that's the main information we feed this thing. And we do need a little bit more information. So do you add a database that starts to give it language, which skews the language, by the way, first of all, but also I think skews, and for me, the one that's a bigger point is it skews its cultural outlook. So if I take on big kind of familiar databases that lots of people use for language modeling, Cornell movie database, right? Maybe Reddit, Google. It becomes already this question of, do I want my system, a system that is supposed to be housing and caring for and perpetuating my family, to be based on these things? In terms of even American, like Western classic movies, the answer is no. I know what those movies think of me and my people, right? And it's not good. It's the kind of stuff that I've been fed as a human, and I think it hasn't served, and it's taken a lot to unravel some of that. So, at each step, I feel like the question becomes, well, are you going to make your own database to base it on? Like, how are you even going to get started? But it also brings up these questions of privacy, what you're putting in public, what you need to keep private, and, other people's information, all of which I've had to consider closely, and think about, the way the project runs is that my family does the interviews because they love me. Like, it's done out of love. That's what it is. Like, that's the community value. So then my love back beyond kind of participation is caring for that information and that data. And while trying to make it transparent and available, also protecting it and who and how we are. And it becomes a fight, because the project has attracted not only like local information, but big corporate attention, right? And what happens if you start to work with different platforms on something like this? And usually I'm thinking about, well, maybe it's a platform and not my data, and kind of separating the two, but trying to figure out the ways in which we deal with our data, keep it our data, and keep the questions about it, or what happens, as Jason was saying, like, is there some kind of trade with the data? Do we even want it out in that way? Do we add it to the bigger data sets that are available because it fills in gaps in different ways, or not? All become questions that the project is boiling up. And I have to say, Jason, my next project that's kind of a big one that we'll be working on for a while is called Binary Calculations Are Inadequate to Assess Us. And it's kind of about this, like, well, where do you put the stuff that doesn't fit or is not supposed to be said in a certain way, but holds a kind of knowledge that also feels really valuable? And that the world could probably use in a certain way, like.
Yeah, no, and I think I think there's really productive, because part of what I'm also trying to do is think about sort of on every other day, on the even days I'm super cranky and I'm like, I don't care if they understand what I'm trying to do. Right. And then the other days I'm like, oh, okay, it'd be nice we could sort of like get some of these people excited about solving these problems. So it's like how to present some of these issues as interesting engineering challenges, right? And I think like what you were just talking about there, reminds me of one of our contributors, Ashley Cord, who's Coquille. She's professor at University of Utah now. She's working with her tribe, thinking about how sort of Bitcoin and AI systems can be used to sort of allow them to capture some of their like cultural knowledge, but then really control how that knowledge gets released out into the world, including sort of being able to pull it back.
Right.
It needs to be, right? And this is a really interesting engineering problem, right? Computer science problem. And it's a big issue, talking to the people in Hawaii, there's a couple potential collaborations there. That's a really big concern there is, okay, so if we do this project where we're working with, people, for instance, who maybe are looking at, kind of standard Western scientific models of the fisheries, right, around Hawaii, but we want to bring in traditional Hawaiian knowledge of those fisheries into the same system so that we can manage it better, because the Western system is like not working that well. Well, what happens to that knowledge then? Does it then become sort of, public domain? Does it become the property of whoever develops the entire system? Can we pull it back if we think it's being abused? Right. So I think this comes into play. This is a common issue. Once you step out of a mindset of, information wants to be free, that, all knowledge belongs to everybody, right? Like once you step outside of those frameworks, which have really just been excuses for, colonial structures to extract knowledge from other people, then you start to get into much more complex set of issues surrounding like, what do I share? How do I take, or actually more importantly for me, how do I take advantage of these technologies, but not buy into that other aspect, which is sort of like kind of insisting that if I want to use these technologies, I have to be willing basically to share everything about myself.
Yeah, it's kind of like this idea, Jason, that you had mentioned about the sort of knowledge framework, equity and diversity within this conversation. Like how do we have conversations, broader conversation about how we think about the ways we think about these things. And I don't know, maybe you would like to.
I'll just say real quick, I mean, one of the things also on my mind is, the difference between representation and epistemology, right? Mm-hmm. So there's talking with, Montreal's a huge AI center. So talking with the people here, research center, people, listening to people in the industry. And, I think that they secretly hope if they've agreed finally that equity and representation are important and they got to do something about it, right? Basically because they've been sort of forced into it. And I think they secretly hope it's going to solve all the problems, right? Going to solve all the ethical problems. Like once they do that, like once there's some Black people there and, maybe some Native people and there's more women and stuff like that, that people will get off their backs. And, my feeling is that doesn't solve that solves a different problem, right? Which is about equity and access, right? Which is an important problem that needs to be solved. But to me, it's not the real problem, which is kind of the fundamental way that they're doing business is problematic, right? And we see this. One of the things I just talked about too was, when I first met with this group a year and a half ago, there were three women, working at Google who were doing ethics work, right? One of them actually couldn't come because she was basically in the process of leaving Google because they were retaliating against her for her work. Timnit Gebru, as we probably all know, just got fired 2 months ago. And then there's a third one that I just read in the news yesterday is now basically she's been kind of her account's been, they haven't fired her, but they've suspended her account and everything, right? So it's like, oh, okay, so great. So you got 3 women in there, one of them a woman of color doing the work. And what happened to them is that they got punished, right? The recent thing with Twitter just did this thing. I can't remember what it was. They did some automated algorithm that basically ended up turning everybody who used it into white people, right? The design, I learned following that the head of design at Twitter is a Black guy, which is awesome.
However,
but it didn't solve it. Like, as he says, the one difference is I find is that in the interviews with him, he like straight up is like, we screwed up, right? We thought we had tested it correctly, but clearly we had not, and we got to do work. So there is that difference. Like instead of the white guy being like, there is no problem, your tests are wrong, or whatever it is that they usually come up with, he copped to it and was like, okay, this is a problem. But the problem remained, right? So we can't just look at it in terms of who's at the table, right? Because that's the current corporate mantra, right? We just got to diversify who's around the table, right? But we got to diversify the way that we think about these things and the way we design these systems.
Yeah, I would agree. It's like care, and I keep bringing up care because I'm thinking a lot about care in these systems and what it means to be deliberate and on the case all the time, as opposed to thinking you've plug something in. And it's also why you trip over the word ecosystems in my bio, Donna, because I'm thinking a lot about what the whole system is as well, because like small changes don't help, especially if you choke people into a corner and don't let them actually do what you hire them ostensibly to do. So, yeah.
Well, we've got about 10 minutes left of our time, and I've seen a lot of questions coming in from our audience, and I want to make sure that we get to some of that. So I might now invite Kelly to come back and join us so that we can carry on with some of this discussion and share some of the questions we've been receiving.
I just have to start by thanking you both for the work you do, and it's so important. And I feel like I have so many questions and they're trying to come together into one Ask One. One of our participants asked if you could just, Stephanie, share the website that you mentioned, the online resource.
Oh, sure.
For creating the chat bots.
Yeah, there are many, but I will give the one that we've been using.
Great.
I'm just going to test it before I actually share it out to make sure it's the right thing. Here we go.
And then we've been sharing a lot of posts, Donna, and I'm going to go ahead unless you have a question. I was pleased to hear you, Stephanie, begin talking about care, because when we had the opportunity to gather last, it was the first place you started. You know, it's something we've been thinking a lot about at Montalvo. It feels like something we all need to think more about in this coming time. But you spoke about caring for machines, and I keep coming back to that, and I keep stumbling around it, and I can almost make logical sense of it. But if you could speak a little bit more about, we've talked for years now about AI's evolution, watching it evolve from our, physical space in Silicon Valley, and how you start building empathy into these systems. And I'm hearing all of the problems that you both can see so clearly in that, but I'm curious about just this idea of care for the machines themselves.
Yeah, as a person who is a caretaker to a strange machinic system, it takes constant supervision or interaction with this thing to know what it's actually doing. And maybe the best way to exemplify what it is, or the problem as I see it, is some research that I've been doing for other problems and looking at some databases. And this is in the realm of the data. And we were looking at a very particular image database and looking at people of color. And then after people of color, Black people. And what still stands as labels for Black people in that widely used, well-distributed image database, like the thing that people use for many, many research projects, is astonishing. Like my collaborator was like, oh no, you've got to see this. And I was like, no, it can't be that bad. And then I looked and it was violent. It was just violent, broad tolerance. And so the idea of, and I'm imagining that information slipped in over time, right? And the idea of how you go in and think about these systems, what's in there, if we want to clean it out or not. And I wonder if you can all hear me. Yes?
Yes.
Okay, cool. If you want to clean it, or how we start to deal with it, because in a way, I think there's a historic nature to some of the terms, right? That if we just cleanse it, that doesn't serve us either. But we have to find ways to deal with the information rather than just leaving it in the database that allows it to be applied and reapplied in ways that are not at all mediated or thought about. And I think this is in lots of spaces, and it's interesting to just in your daily research go, oh, okay. So in one way, care for me in terms of that database would be going through often to see what's actually there, what we're propagating and is questioning whether that wants to be propagated. The way it is physically is, you know, just keeping something alive and being able to function. If you're working with a machine now, becomes really important. Like I worry about things like my computer's dying greatly because it would kill the thing I'm working on. Like I have 2 versions of Not the Only One that are currently just down. Like the computers have died. We're using an older system of TensorFlow. So it becomes about, oh my gosh, what do you do to maintain this? And do I just go ahead and do the easy thing? Because I could pick up the new version of TensorFlow and kind of do some trickery to make it look good, but I'm not interested in how good it looks in public. I'm more interested in doing the work of seeing how that system functions and handles the information that we're working with and how we can make it different. So it's about a kind of constant excavation and massaging of the information and thinking about it in reference to the communities that it is actually working with. And I feel like we need to do that across the board. And I know it's a crazy, awful amount of work, but work that seems really necessary.
Yeah, and you know, when we, you know, thinking about this issue of like the amount of work that's necessary, you know, it's really a question of like how we evaluate the damage that it does, right? So if we evaluate the damage as like, oh, that's unfortunate, you know, there's a few bad blah blah, you know, then it's like, oh God, well, of course we're never going to do that work. But if we actually evaluate it as being existential, right, like it actually has mortal implication or consequences, then it becomes a different thing. You know, I've been thinking a lot. It's weird. I've been thinking about uranium. I've been thinking about like, you know, here's this incredibly valuable resource that we can do some amazing things with, you know, but eventually it took a while for people to figure out like, oh, well, we can't just leave this like laying around. And we have to stop sending people in to mine it without giving them protections. And like, there's a whole series of things that came in where it's like, okay, this is really valuable, but if we're going to keep doing this, then we got to do all these things to make it relatively safe, you know? Yeah. Now, I'm not saying it's as, you know, it's as poisonous as like uranium, though, you know, we could maybe make an argument about that. But I think it's a question, it comes down to this question of like, you know, there's lots of things that we could do in this world that are just so patently dangerous to some group of people that we don't do them, right? But that, it seems like we can't say that when we come to like this big data stuff, you know, because the founding assumption is that it's just free anyways. It's just floating out there somewhere. We might as well make use of it.
And so the issue around like the big language models, the big data models for AI, is just the amount of, the criticism is like the amount of energy that it's drawing on.
Yeah.
Well, that's a whole other.
Yeah, that's a whole, yeah.
I love it.
That's a whole other ball of wax.
Yeah.
But it's interesting, just in terms of what Jason was saying, and it's also about what damage is done to whom, right? Or where those communities are. Like I've been on reservations with big tanks of like radioactive material. And it's like, wait, what? Like, how did this get here? And it's far enough out from the regular community, right? Whatever that might be. But I also think that we're at a very interesting moment because we're starting to see each other more in ourselves. Like the way that society is moving, it seems that we're starting to see ourselves in one way or another. We can see more of the things that we used to be able to push aside as that doesn't pertain to me, right? And I'm hopeful in a way that if we can start to see those things and the things that might hurt more and more communities, that we do a little bit about it. But I also think that that's like crazy pie in the sky. But the question is, how do we start to make it important, like anything important enough, right? And if that data is something we need, and it's really all of ours, how do we start to function around it? What are the rules? And I think the blockchain example, and I'm probably going to be doing some blockchain thought as well, and agreements through blockchain becomes really kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Right.
it's a little bit, Jason, the question for you of why is AI where we can penetrate, but it could be that AI can also become the tool with which to do some of this work.
Absolutely.
I mean, the more voices. And so, in many ways, like we spoke about when we were last together, this is like this new frontier. And when many of us are spending so much time thinking about the systemic racist systems, that have been put into place. And this is a really interesting sort of place to start thinking about breaking them down, reframing them, rebuilding them. And I guess, as we're running out of time, if either of you or both of you have one sort of final thought, for me, it's like if you could wave the magic wand and see and see what you would ultimately wish for happen within this field, what does that look like?
Well, I'll echo, a bit of what Stephanie was saying earlier, right? Is, for me, what I'm learning in my own journey, understanding more of Hawaiian epistemologies, other, Indigenous epistemologies, is one way of describing them is, they're centered on care, right? They're centered on the notion that you have a responsibility to care for the other entities that are in your world. And so what I'm interested in, what I think we can do is we can build systems that start there. They don't start with profit optimization. They don't start with, I don't know, other things we can think of that they could be optimized for, but they start with, a framework of, okay, how do we define a community of care here? And then how do we make sure that the work that we want this system to do, contributes to that, rather than threatens it or undermines it or goes against it, and I think that once we can do things like that, then a lot of other things sort themselves out. Not magically, you still got to do the work, right? But, if that's what you kind of lean into these things as you're building these systems, even, you can think about self-driving cars, you can think about, the way that we do mortgage, the systems are doing automatic mortgage evaluations, like everywhere, think about how different it would be if it would be start with care. Like the self-driving, talk to the self-driving care people or self-driving car people, and they're not worried about care. They're just worried about not getting sued.
Exactly, right? Care over profit.
Our new campaign.
Yeah.
Yeah, care over profit.
Do you have some final thoughts, Stephanie, that you'd like to add?
I actually think that Jason just did a really good job of saying, and I agree, right? This idea of bringing care to the core and really thinking about what it would mean to sustain communities, societies, governments through care, versus what we're trying to do now, which is protection, right? That idea of we need to protect what we have, we need to grow what we have, right? What would it be if we inserted care first? Yeah, I can't even say more than that. I think care first, and not thinking, because now that I'm talking about this idea of care in the systems, this is another place where people are like, oh no, not possible, can't do it. It's like, well, you just don't want to think about it. I know it probably means a lot of change, but we need that change. So let's start picking it apart. And my answer to that is, well, I guess I just need to try to make something that looks something like care in a system. So it's kind of a challenge to the rest of you. And that's what I got.
These engineering challenges.
Yeah, exactly.
We put it out to these brilliant young minds and we give them the challenge.
Give them the challenge and tell them to think outside of the box of their education a bit, and maybe we'll get somewhere. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank both of you for a really fascinating conversation. It could have gone on much longer, and I hope it will, as I'm hoping both of you are going to be joining us at the residency, and we will be able to continue these conversations.
That would be great.
Person. So thank you and very much. And I'm sure Kelly would want to echo those thanks. And I'm going to ask Kelly to tell us what we have coming up in Scratch Space next week.
Will. Just joining Donna, I can't thank you both enough. You're doing hard work, you're doing important work, and it's a treat to spend this time with you. So next week, we will release a pre-recorded conversation from November where we spoke with disabled activist, media maker, and consultant Alice Wong, who will discuss her work as founder and director of the Disability Visibility Project and her recently edited book, Disability Visibility, First-Person Stories from the 21st Century. Alice will be joined by LucasArts fellow Jason Lazarus and Sebren Vierstig, who will describe their recent public project, Public Address, a nationwide virtual protest in support of Black Lives Matter that prioritized the civic engagement of individuals who are immunocompromised and their caregivers, people with disabilities, and other community members who could not be at the protests in the physical. We'll be exploring how we can widen the possibilities of political participation, access, visibility for historically marginalized communities, and how we can start to reconceptualize access as an act of love. Hope you'll join us. Thank you both.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.